the acrid smoke, mixed with the sweet scent of burning palm oil as screams shattered the humid December night. By dawn on Christmas morning 1952, the Dubois colonial manor would be nothing more than charred timber and twisted metal beneath the African sky. This is the story of how one girl's desperate hunger for dignity consumed an entire household in the heart of the Belgian Congo, where justice came wrapped in flames and fury. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The heavy rains had stopped 3 days before Christmas, leaving the air thick and steaming in the Kasai Province. Inside the imposing brick manor house, crystal glasses clinked with imported Belgian wine while ceiling fans stirred the humid air above polished mahogany tables. Electric lights, powered by the plantation's own generator, cast warm glows through mosquito-netted windows. But beyond the manicured gardens, in the workers' compound where forced laborers huddled in corrugated iron-roofed quarters, the texture of rough burlap provided little comfort against walls that leaked moisture through every crack. 17-year-old Amara Mukendi had witnessed this same ritual of colonial excess every Christmas Eve since she could remember. Through rain-streaked windows she observed the Dubois family feast on imported pâté, roasted guinea fowl, and delicate Belgian chocolates while her own stomach cramped with emptiness. Her mother, Mama Nsala, worked in the manor's kitchen, preparing elaborate European dishes she would never taste, her hands permanently stained from years of scrubbing pots and serving masters who saw her as less than human. The Dubois plantation sprawled across 3,000 hectares of rich Congolese soil, carved from ancestral lands and maintained through the forced labor of 89 souls. Monsieur Laurent Dubois had received the concession from the colonial administration in Brussels, along with what he considered the natural order of African subjugation. His wife, Madame Claire, presided over the household with the refined cruelty of European colonialism, speaking French in carefully modulated tones that carried the weight of absolute authority. Their 3 children, Henri aged 16, Marguerite 14, and little Philippe only 9, had never known hunger, hardship, or the weight of another person's whip across their backs. But Amara knew all 3 intimately. Born into the system of forced labor that had replaced slavery in name only, she had learned early that survival meant swallowing rage along with whatever scraps fell from the master's table. Her mother had taught her to keep her eyes downcast, her voice soft, her movements careful around the Belgian family. "The elephant that makes noise gets hunted first," Mama Nsala whispered during those sweltering nights when sleep came slowly. "Wait for your moment, child. The ancestors will show you when." Yet as Amara grew into womanhood, waiting felt like slow death rather than patient strategy. Each passing season brought fresh humiliations, new demonstrations of her worthlessness in colonial eyes. She had watched her childhood friend Coffee sold to a rubber plantation near Leopoldville, his family powerless to intervene as Patrice Ngoma, the Congolese overseer, handed over the transfer papers. She saw her mother's hands crack and bleed from endless hours over hot stoves and harsh cleaning chemicals imported from Belgium. She felt Monsieur Laurent's predatory gaze lingering too long when she cleaned the main house, his pale eyes following her movements with the calculating interest of a man who believed African women existed for his pleasure. The wet season of 1952 had brought particular hardships. Palm oil prices had fallen in European markets, and Monsieur Laurent's response was to increase quotas for the forced laborers while maintaining the lavish lifestyle his family enjoyed in their brick manor. Amara watched her mother grow thinner as food rations were cut, watched the elderly workers in the compound cough blood from lung infections that Dr. van der Berg dismissed as tropical weakness, watched children cry themselves to sleep from hunger while the Dubois family dined on 7-course meals prepared by hands that would never taste such abundance. Through it all, the Belgians planned elaborate Christmas celebrations, importing decorations and delicacies from Europe while their African workers subsisted on cassava flour and whatever small fish they could catch in the Kasai River during their few free hours each week. The contrast had always been stark, but on Christmas Eve 1952, it reached a breaking point that would change everything. As the first stars appeared through the humid darkness, Madame Claire hosted her annual Christmas soiree for the local colonial. Belgian administrators arrived in official vehicles, their wives draped in European fashions completely unsuited to the African climate. The manor blazed with electric light, while generator noise hummed beneath sounds of laughter and accordion music that drifted across the compound like mockery. Amara served at that gathering, carrying silver trays of European canapés, refilling crystal goblets with French champagne that cost more than most workers earned in a year of forced labor. Her stomach growled audibly as she watched guests abandon plates still heavy with imported delicacies. When young Philippe Dubois complained that the chocolate cake was too rich and pushed away a serving that represented more calories than many African children saw in a week, something deep in Amara's chest began to burn with an intensity that matched the humid night air. The casual waste, the deliberate excess performed in front of starving people, the complete absence of any recognition of African humanity in these European celebrations, all of it crystallized into a rage that demanded expression. The breaking point came near midnight, as Amara cleared dishes from the main dining room where colonial officials had gathered around imported cigars and Belgian brandy. She discovered a conversation between Monsieur Laurent and Commandant Rousseau, the regional administrative head, who spoke in low French near the large stone fireplace, assuming the African girl was too ignorant to understand their language. She was not. "The workers are becoming restless," Rousseau reported, his weather-beaten face grim in the electric light. "Production quotas are falling short, and there have been reports of work slowdowns across the province." Monsieur Laurent swirled his brandy thoughtfully, the amber liquid catching reflections from the overhead fan. "We must reduce their food allocations again come January," he replied with the casual indifference of a man discussing livestock management. "The household accounts require priority, naturally. Cut their rations by half if necessary. The weak ones will not survive the dry season." Rousseau nodded approvingly. "What about the sick workers? Old Tata Maël has been coughing blood for weeks, and several children show signs of malnutrition." "Disease will solve our overpopulation problem," Laurent replied, taking another sip of brandy that cost more than most families saw in months. "It is nature's way of maintaining proper balance. The plantation benefits from reduced overhead expenses." Amara's hands trembled as she lifted a sterling silver serving dish, her knuckles white with suppressed fury. Reduced overhead expenses. Her people were dying, and these men calculated their deaths like bookkeeping entries. As the guests departed and the family retired to their air-cooled bedrooms, Amara remained in the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning but actually planning something that would transform her from victim into agent of change. The great house grew quiet except for the distant hum of the generator and the constant chirping of insects in the tropical night. Even her mother had finally collapsed into exhausted sleep in the servants' quarters behind the main building. But sleep would not come for Amara that night, because she had finally understood what the ancestors had been trying to tell her through years of dreams and whispered guidance. Sometimes justice required more than patience, sometimes it demanded fire. She thought of coffee, sold away like a piece of furniture to satisfy colonial quotas. She thought of the children in the compound whose bellies swelled with hunger while European children complained about too much chocolate cake. She thought of her mother's scarred hands and her father's death in the mines, crushed by equipment that Belgian engineers had declared too expensive to properly maintain. She thought of Monsieur Laurent's words about disease solving overpopulation problems, and the way Commandant Rousseau had nodded as if African lives were mathematical problems to be solved through elimination. The manor house contained so many beautiful flammable things. Silk curtains imported from Brussels at enormous expense. Mahogany furniture polished to mirror brightness by African hands that would never own such luxuries. Persian rugs worth more than entire villages would earn in lifetimes of colonial subjugation. All of it built on the backs of people who were considered expendable overhead expenses in colonial accounting books. As the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight on Christmas morning.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Amara made her choice. She lifted an oil lamp from the kitchen table, its flame dancing in the humid darkness like a prayer and a curse combined. Her bare feet moved silently across cool tile floors as she climbed the servants' staircase toward the main house, carrying more than just fire in her hands. She carried the accumulated rage of generations, the desperation of the dying, and the terrible clarity that comes when someone realizes they have nothing left to lose except their dignity. What drives a person beyond fear, beyond self-preservation, beyond the survival instincts that had kept her alive through 17 years of colonial brutality? The flame waited in her grasp like judgment itself, ready to write justice in smoke and ash across the African sky. Would she have the courage to light the match that would change everything, knowing that freedom might come at the ultimate price? The lamp flame flickered as Amara stepped into the main parlor, casting dancing shadows across portraits of dead Belgians who had built their colonial legacy on African suffering. Tonight their painted eyes would witness the end of that legacy, consumed by flames that recognized no difference between European and African flesh. This single moment would determine whether generations of exploitation would continue unchallenged or be answered with fire that burned away the illusion of colonial permanence. The grandfather clock's pendulum swung with mechanical precision, marking each second that brought Amara closer to a choice that could never be undone, in a house that represented everything wrong with the world she had been born into, on a night when Christmas celebration would become something entirely different than anyone expected. The parlor smelled of lingering cigar smoke and expensive Belgian perfume, while thick Persian rugs muffled Amara's footsteps as she moved through rooms she had cleaned countless times but never truly owned. French silk curtains hung like colonial flags, heavy and still in the humid night air. Every ornament in this space represented money that could have fed her entire community for months. Every piece of imported furniture cost more than most Congolese families would see in several lifetimes of forced labor under Belgian rule. The massive stone fireplace, cold now except for dying embers, was framed by marble that Monsieur Laurent had bragged cost more than the annual wages of 50 plantation workers. Amara approached the grandest window where curtains imported directly from Brussels hung in golden splendor, their threads catching the lamplight like captured sunbeams. The fabric felt softer than water between her fingertips, softer than any cloth that had ever touched her weathered skin. These curtains alone had cost more than her mother earned in 3 years of kitchen labor, preparing meals for people who viewed African lives as expendable resources. A sudden creak from upstairs froze her in place, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Footsteps crossed the ceiling above, someone moving through the second floor of the colonial manor. Amara held her breath, counting heartbeats until the sound faded into silence, probably Monsieur Laurent visiting his private study where he kept detailed records of plantation operations, and his collection of rare European liquors smuggled past colonial customs officials. Those account books contained the real story of the Dubois plantation, pages filled with calculations that reduced human beings to production units and maintenance costs. Amara had glimpsed them while dusting his study, ledgers that listed African workers between agricultural equipment and livestock purchases. Her own name appeared in those records, valued at less than the mahogany desk where Laurent conducted his correspondence with Brussels administrators about maximizing colonial profits through what they euphemistically called native labor optimization. The lamp oil dripped onto her wrist, the brief burn focusing her resolve like a brand marking this moment as her own. She lifted the flame toward the curtain's edge, but memories flooded back with the intensity of tropical rainfall, threatening to wash away her courage before she could act. She remembered the whispered stories her mother told of other workers who had dared to resist colonial authority. Their punishments became legends shared in the compound, cautionary tales meant to discourage rebellion through the currency of terror. There was Tata Musonda, who had refused to work the rubber trees during the early days of Belgian rule, tied to a post and beaten until his back looked like plowed earth. Mama Dikembe, who had hidden food from the plantation stores to feed starving children, burned alive in the village square while colonial officials forced her family to watch as an example to others who might consider similar acts of defiance. The fate of rebels was always the same across colonial Africa, death designed to terrorize any others who might harbor thoughts of resistance against European rule. Yet as Amara stood there in the humid darkness, she realized something that changed everything about her understanding of survival and death. She was already dying, along with everyone she loved. The slow starvation imposed by reduced rations, the brutal working conditions that killed men like her father in mining accidents, the complete dehumanization that stripped away dignity until nothing remained but animal existence. This was death by degrees, stretched across years instead of moments. At least fire would be quick. At least fire would treat Belgian flesh the same way it treated African flesh. She touched the flame to the curtain's hem with deliberate precision. The silk caught immediately, orange tongues racing up the expensive fabric with hungry enthusiasm that seemed almost alive. The fire spread faster than she had anticipated, consuming the golden threads and racing toward the ceiling moldings with an appetite that appeared supernatural. The room filled with acrid smoke as flames leaped from the curtains to a nearby tapestry depicting some romantic European countryside that had never known the reality of colonial exploitation. Amara watched, mesmerized as fire devoured images of pastoral scenes that represented everything Belgium had stolen from Congo, the illusion of European civilization built on African blood and labor. The flames seemed to dance with their own intelligence, selecting targets that represented colonial excess while avoiding the simple wooden furniture that reminded her of home. This was not random destruction but something approaching divine judgment, fire that recognized the difference between necessity and luxury. The fire's appetite proved relentless and discriminating. Within minutes, it had spread to the mahogany bookshelf that contained leather-bound volumes of European philosophy and literature that spoke eloquently of human dignity, while their owners practiced systematic dehumanization. The Persian rug began to smolder, filling the air with the scent of burning wool and expensive dyes imported from distant lands while local artisans starved for lack of markets for their own work. Amara moved to the next room with the measured pace of someone fulfilling a sacred duty rather than committing a crime. Each space told the same story of wealth extracted from African labor, luxury purchased with Congolese lives, comfort built on a foundation of systematic brutality. In the dining room, she touched her flame to the lace tablecloth where she had served countless meals to people who discussed African workers like livestock while consuming food prepared by the very people they dehumanized. The fine Belgian linen caught like kindling, spreading flames across the polished table where Monsieur Laurent had casually discussed reducing food rations for workers while planning to import more expensive wine from European vineyards. The fire consumed the heart of colonial hospitality, the engine of social gatherings where Europeans reinforced their sense of racial superiority through shared consumption of wealth extracted from African land and labor. The kitchen proved even more satisfying to destroy. Here, where her mother's hands had bled preparing feast after feast for people who saw her as slightly more valuable than farm equipment, Amara lit the window treatments, the wooden spice racks imported from Belgium, and the cloth-covered bread baskets that held imported European flour while local people subsisted on cassava and whatever protein they could catch or grow in their few free hours. Fire consumed the operational center of the colonial household, the machinery of domestic comfort that required constant African labor to maintain European standards of living in a climate and environment completely unsuited to such excess. As she climbed the servants' staircase toward the second floor, smoke began to thicken the air with the sweet smell of burning luxury. The house's timber construction, seasoned by decades of tropical humidity and termite damage, fed the flames with surprising eagerness. What had taken generations to accumulate through colonial exploitation would be destroyed in hours through the application of scientific principles that recognized no difference between European and African property. The family bedrooms lay ahead, doors closed against the growing heat and smoke that represented the first equality these walls had ever witnessed. Behind those doors, the Dubois family slept peacefully in their imported silk nightclothes, beneath covers stuffed with goose down harvested from European farms while their African workers slept on straw mats woven from local grass. Monsieur Laurent's study occupied the corner room overlooking the workers' compound, its windows positioned so he could survey his human property, while conducting the correspondence and record-keeping that made colonial exploitation appear legitimate on paper. From this room, he had written reports to Brussels about maximizing labor efficiency, sharing strategies for managing what colonial administrators called the native workforce, calculating profit margins from human misery, with the precision of an accountant. Amara entered this sanctuary of colonial power with the lamp held high, illuminating shelves lined with official documents, maps showing mineral concessions across Congo, and correspondence with other plantation owners about coordinating labor policies across the region. She set those papers ablaze first, watching decades of colonial administration burn like the lies they had always been. Let his bureaucracy burn before his body, let his profits turn to ash before his pride could even awaken to comprehend what was happening. The flames consumed records of worker purchases from other plantations, detailed breeding schedules for what they called native population management, punishment logs that documented systematic brutality with bureaucratic precision, and correspondence about the African problem with colonial administrators who viewed Congolese people as obstacles to efficient resource extraction. The heat was becoming intense now, sweat pouring down Amara's face as she moved from room to room with methodical determination. She could hear the flames roaring below, consuming the main floor with increasing fury that seemed to feed on years of accumulated injustice. The house's structure began to groan and crack as support beams weakened under temperatures that made survival impossible for anyone still inside. Soon the smoke would penetrate even the sealed bedrooms where the colonial family slept. Soon they would discover that their world of absolute power was ending as suddenly and violently as they had ended so many African lives through casual cruelty, disguised as administrative efficiency. The Christmas Eve celebration that had begun with imported champagne and European delicacies would end with something far more democratic than any colonial gathering had ever achieved. Fire recognized no racial hierarchies, no colonial privileges, no European claims to superior civilization. In the democracy of flame and smoke, Belgian flesh would burn exactly like Congolese flesh, and colonial pretensions would prove as flammable as the expensive silk that had symbolized their assumed superiority. But would the colonial family understand in their final moments that this was justice rather than mere criminal destruction? Would they recognize that their deaths were payment for the accumulated debt of colonial exploitation, or would they die believing themselves innocent victims of African savagery? The answer lay waiting in the smoke-filled hallway where bedroom doors remained closed against the approaching inferno that would treat European lives with exactly the same casual indifference that had characterized their treatment of African humanity. The rising heat made clear that this was no longer a house fire but something approaching a funeral pyre for an entire system of exploitation. The flames had achieved a life of their own, consuming not just physical structures but the very foundations of colonial authority. What had begun as one girl's desperate act of rebellion was becoming something larger and more significant, a reckoning that would challenge how people understood power, justice, and the price of willful blindness to systematic cruelty. Madame Claire's scream shattered the humid night like glass breaking against stone, a sound that carried across the compound and into the forest beyond. The cry that followed, children's voices raised in terror and confusion, would be the last sounds the Dubois family would make as masters of other human beings. This was the moment when colonial privilege discovered that wealth could not purchase immunity from consequences, when European assumptions of racial superiority met the equalizing force of African fire. The acrid smell of burning silk and timber filled the second-floor hallway as smoke poured under bedroom doors like rivers of judgment seeking the sea. The family that had slept peacefully while their African workers suffered was now experiencing something they had never known, the terror of helplessness in the face of forces beyond their control. The floorboards beneath their feet grew hot as flames consumed the supporting structure below, while thick smoke made each breath a struggle for survival that no amount of colonial authority could overcome. Monsieur Laurent was the first to understand the full scope of the disaster that was consuming his world of absolute power. He burst from his study to find the hallway choked with smoke, paint blistering on the walls as fire climbed from the main floor with relentless hunger. His silk nightgown, worth more than most African families would see in years of forced labor, was already singed from the intense heat that recognized no difference between imported fabric and local cloth. "Claire, children, the house is burning." His voice cracked with panic as he pounded on bedroom doors, his commanding tone dissolving into fear as he faced something that could not be controlled through colonial authority or administrative orders. The man who had commanded 89 human beings with the casual confidence of racial superiority now found himself powerless against the most democratic of forces, fire that consumed European and African flesh with identical enthusiasm. Young Marguerite emerged first, her delicate nightdress torn as she stumbled through smoke that burned her eyes and throat with the same intensity her father's policies had brought to African lives. At 14 she had lived her entire existence surrounded by colonial luxury, protected from every hardship by her family's position in the racial hierarchy that defined Belgian Congo. Now she faced something that recognized neither European blood nor colonial privileges, something that treated white skin exactly like black skin when it came to the business of burning. Henry followed, carrying 9-year-old Philippe in his arms as the youngest Dubois child coughed violently, his small body racked by smoke inhalation that no colonial medical care could immediately cure. The boy who had complained about chocolate cake being too rich just hours earlier now gasped desperately for clean air that no amount of Belgian money could purchase in a house where every breath brought more smoke and less oxygen. Madame Claire appeared last, her elaborate nighttime beauty routine abandoned as she clutched a jewelry box, the instinct to save valuables overriding maternal concern in a moment that revealed the true nature of colonial priorities. Her perfectly arranged hair, maintained daily by African women who styled it according to European fashion, now hung in disheveled strands across her soot-stained face that looked remarkably similar to the faces of African workers she had dismissed as inherently inferior. The servant stares Laurent commanded, though his voice held none of its usual authority over African lives, the colonial confidence replaced by desperate hope that some escape route remained available. They would use the back staircase that Amara had climbed with her lamp, the narrow steps designed for African feet carrying European comfort. But when the family reached that staircase, they discovered it already consumed by flames that crackled and roared with the sound of centuries of injustice finally finding expression. The wooden steps collapsed as they watched, sending up showers of sparks that ignited Claire's silk robe and scattered her precious jewelry across burning floorboards where European gems mixed with African ash in a democracy that colonial society had never allowed. Terror, they discovered, recognizes no social hierarchy, no racial superiority, no claims to European civilization. In the face of fire, all human flesh burns with identical efficiency. The main staircase offered their last hope of escape from the colonial mansion that had symbolized their absolute power over African lives. But as the family rushed toward the grand foyer where they had received so many visiting officials and hosted so many celebrations of European superiority, they discovered that fire had claimed that route as well. The mahogany banister, polished weekly by African hands that would never own such luxury, now blazed like a torch constructed from their own pretensions. The crystal chandelier that had illuminated elegant dinner parties where the African problem was discussed like an intellectual exercise swayed dangerously as heat weakened the ceiling supports, threatening to crash down on European heads with the same casual violence that had characterized Belgian treatment of Congolese workers.
We're trapped on the second floor of a burning colonial mansion, surrounded by the very luxuries that had defined their racial superiority and social position. The imported wallpaper curled and blackened around them like a map of colonial Africa burning away. The Turkish carpet smoldered beneath their feet with the same heat that African workers had felt under the tropical sun while laboring to maintain European comfort. Everything beautiful, everything expensive, everything that had separated them from the common masses now served as fuel for their destruction, the material culture of colonialism transformed into the instruments of colonial death. Laurent tried the windows with hands that had never known manual labor, his soft fingers proving useless against window latches painted shut for the dry season protection. He pounded on the thick glass with a silver candlestick that had been polished by African hands, but the imported panes were too substantial to break easily, designed to keep the African environment out and European comfort in. Now those same windows trapped European bodies inside while fire consumed the illusions of racial superiority that had made their comfort possible. Meanwhile, in the workers' compound behind the burning colonial mansion, the forced laborers had awakened to the smell of smoke and the orange glow of flames painting the humid night sky with colors that seemed almost supernatural. Some ran instinctively toward the house where they had labored for years, their conditioning to serve overriding rational thought even as their oppressors' world burned before their eyes. Others stood motionless in the red dirt between their corrugated iron shelters, watching generations of accumulated colonial wealth transform into ash and memory. Among those who hesitated stood Mama Nsala, Amara's mother, her weathered hands pressed against her mouth as she searched the crowd of onlookers for her daughter's familiar silhouette. The timing was too deliberate to be coincidental, too perfectly aligned with decades of accumulated rage to be accidental. As she watched flames consume the brick manor where she had bled preparing meals for people who viewed her as livestock, she felt something she had never experienced in 23 years of forced labor under Belgian rule. The sensation of witnessing justice served hot as palm oil fresh from the press. "Where is Amara?" asked Tata Mayela, the elderly worker whose chronic cough had marked him for death in Laurent's casual calculations. "Has anyone seen that girl tonight?" The question hung in the humid air like smoke itself, heavy with implications that nobody wanted to voice aloud. Some suspected, but none dared speak their thoughts in words that might reach colonial ears. If Amara had done this thing, she had accomplished what every person in the compound had dreamed of doing but never possessed the courage to attempt. The moral weight of the moment pressed down on the entire community like the heavy air before a tropical storm. These were people who had spent their lives preserving the very system that enslaved them, who had been trained from birth to value European lives above their own freedom, who had internalized the colonial logic that painted African resistance as savage criminality. Now faced with the chance to break those chains of mental bondage, they discovered that liberation felt more like sin than salvation. Van der Berg arrived first among the European responders, his medical bag clutched in hands that trembled not from age but from the recognition that his comfortable world of colonial privilege was literally going up in smoke. Behind him came Patrice Goma, the Congolese overseer whose collaboration with Belgian authority had earned him a marginally better existence than his fellow Africans. Both men stared at the inferno with expressions that mixed horror and dawning understanding of what this night would mean for colonial authority across the entire region. The flames were too advanced, too complete, too strategically distributed to represent anything but deliberate arson planned with intimate knowledge of the building's layout and the family's routines. This was not random destruction born of momentary rage but calculated revenge executed with the precision of someone who had studied their target like a military objective. The implications were staggering for a colonial system built on the assumption of African intellectual inferiority and natural submissiveness. Back inside the burning mansion, the Dubois family's desperation had reached the point where European dignity and colonial pretensions no longer mattered. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke so thick that each breath brought more poison than oxygen into European lungs that had never known such suffering. Young Philippe had stopped coughing and lay motionless in his brother's arms, the 9-year-old boy who would never grow up to inherit African slaves becoming the first victim of fire's democratic justice. Madame Claire knelt beside her youngest son's still form, her perfectly manicured hands now useless to save the child whose existence had been built on the systematic exploitation of other children forced to labor in mines and plantations across Congo. The woman who had presided over dinner parties where African lives were discussed like agricultural statistics now faced a problem that no amount of European social grace could solve. Monsieur Laurent continued his desperate attempts to break the windows that had once symbolized the barrier between European civilization and African savagery. The irony was not lost on those watching from the compound below, European hands pounding uselessly against glass while African hands had built every comfort those windows had protected. The man who had spoken casually of culling the weak through deliberate starvation now found himself among those marked for elimination by forces beyond his control. As the ceiling began to buckle and beams crashed down in showers of sparks that illuminated the family's final moments, the Dubois household huddled together in their burning colonial mansion like defendants awaiting judgment from a court that recognized no appeals to racial superiority. 3 generations of wealth extracted from Congolese labor were being erased in a single night, consumed by flames that made no distinction between European and African flesh when it came to the business of burning. But the most haunting question remained unanswered as smoke filled every corner of the collapsing structure. Where was the architect of this destruction? Had Amara escaped the flames she had ignited, disappearing into the tropical forest that surrounded the plantation like countless other Africans who had chosen death over continued bondage? Or had she made the ultimate sacrifice, choosing to burn with the system that had enslaved her rather than flee and leave the job incomplete? The answer came from an unexpected source as Commandant Rousseau arrived with a contingent of colonial police, their vehicles cutting through the humid night like mechanical harbingers of European order attempting to reassert itself over African chaos. But what they found challenged every assumption about colonial control and African capabilities. This was not random destruction that could be dismissed as primitive violence but strategic warfare executed with an intelligence that colonial ideology insisted did not exist in the African mind. Historical records from the provincial archives in Leopoldville later discovered during Congo's independence movement would document witness testimony from that Christmas morning in 1952. Multiple observers reported seeing a figure moving calmly through the flames apparently unaffected by smoke or heat that would have killed anyone else within minutes. Some claimed to have seen a young woman dancing in the fire like it was cooling rain, moving with the fluid grace of traditional Luba ceremonial dance translated into an element that should have consumed her immediately. Whether these accounts represented accurate observation or the product of traumatized minds struggling to process unprecedented events, they captured something essential about what had happened that night. Amara Mukendi had transformed from property into agent of historical change, had claimed power in the only way available to someone who owned nothing, not even legal recognition as a human being. She had crossed the line from victim to force of nature, from enslaved laborer to instrument of divine justice. The colonial community's response revealed the deep fear that Amara's action had struck into the heart of European assumptions about racial hierarchy and African capabilities. Within hours of the fire, emergency meetings were being held in administrative offices across the province as colonial officials grappled with the implications of what appeared to be a perfectly planned and executed military operation carried out by someone they had classified as mentally inferior livestock. The cover-up began immediately, driven by the recognition that news of successful African resistance could inspire similar actions across the vast territory that Belgium controlled through force and the illusion of European superiority. Official reports would describe the fire as a tragic accident caused by electrical failure in the plantation's generator system, the kind of technical malfunction that could happen anywhere without suggesting African agency or capability for strategic thinking. But in the workers' compounds scattered across colonial Congo, a different story began to spread with the speed of drums carrying messages through the forest. They spoke of the fire girl who had chosen flames over chains, who had disappeared into legend and inspiration. The tale grew with each retelling, becoming less about one girl's desperate act and more about the possibility that resistance was achievable, that colonial power was not as absolute as Europeans claimed. The brass key found in the ashes of Laurent's study became a symbol that transcended its physical reality. Unlike the original Virginia story, this key bore engravings in traditional Luba script, symbols that spoke of ancestral guidance and spiritual protection for those who chose justice over safety. Whether Amara had left it deliberately as a message or whether it appeared through some other means, it represented access to freedom for those brave enough to turn it. Within months of the Christmas fire, similar incidents began occurring across Belgian Congo with a frequency that alarmed colonial administrators, but which they dared not acknowledge publicly. Plantation houses burned in Katanga Province, administrative buildings mysteriously caught fire in Kasai, mining company offices were consumed by flames that appeared to start simultaneously in multiple locations, always leaving behind those same brass keys with Luba engravings. The economic impact extended far beyond direct property damage as European investors grew nervous about the stability of their colonial investments. Insurance companies began refusing coverage for properties in remote areas, citing unexplained fire risks that made colonial enterprises economically unviable. Banks restricted loans for new plantation development, recognizing that facilities might disappear overnight without explanation or legal recourse. Amara's Christmas fire had demonstrated something that would eventually contribute to the collapse of colonial rule across Africa. European power was not absolute, African intelligence was not inferior, and the system of exploitation contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. One girl's desperate act of resistance had become a template that could be replicated by others who reached their own breaking points with colonial brutality. The legend of the fire girl spread beyond Congo's borders, inspiring similar acts of resistance across colonial Africa as news of successful rebellion traveled through networks of communication that Europeans never fully understood or controlled. Frederick Douglass wrote about divine retribution visiting the houses of bondage, while Pan-African intellectuals recognized in Amara's story a perfect example of how individual courage could challenge entire systems of oppression. The most significant impact was psychological rather than economic or political. Colonial officials who had once slept peacefully in their compounds now lay awake listening for footsteps, watching for smoke, wondering if their turn had come to face the consequences of their participation in systematic brutality. The absolute power they had wielded over African lives was revealed as an illusion dependent on African cooperation and consent. The last documented fire bearing Amara's signature occurred in 1958 at a mining operation near Elizabethville, just 2 years before Congo's independence. Like all the others, it consumed everything except a mysterious circle of unburned ground where a brass key waited among the ashes. But this time witnesses reported something different, a figure walking away from the flames with the measured pace of someone whose work was finally completed. Whether this figure was Amara herself, now in her early 20s after 6 years of legendary resistance, or someone else carrying forward her mission would never be determined. By 1960, when Congo achieved independence from Belgian rule, the fires had stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind only stories and the lingering question of what had happened to the girl who had chosen fire over bondage. The civil rights movements that swept across Africa and America in the following decades would recognize Amara's Christmas fire as a crucial precedent for understanding how individual acts of resistance could challenge entire systems of oppression. Her story became a touchstone for those who argued that violence against oppressive systems was not only justified but necessary when all other avenues for justice had been exhausted. Today visitors to what was once the Dubois plantation find only an empty clearing in the tropical forest where coffee plants once grew and a single brick chimney that marks where a colonial mansion once stood. Local people say that on humid December nights when the air is heavy with the promise of rain, you can still smell wood smoke carrying on the wind and hear the sound of bare feet moving purposefully through the darkness. They say the fire girl never really left Congo, that she became part of the land itself, waiting in the forest for justice to be needed once again. Whether this represents wishful thinking from people still struggling with the aftermath of colonial exploitation or something more mysterious, the legend continues to inspire those who face seemingly impossible odds against systematic oppression. The brass keys found at each fire site remain unexplained by any official investigation, their Luba engravings translating roughly to concepts of ancestral guidance and spiritual protection for those who choose justice over personal safety. Anthropologists who have studied them suggest they may represent a form of resistance communication, symbols passed between members of an underground network that connected acts of rebellion across the colonial territory. But perhaps the most important legacy of Amara's Christmas fire is its demonstration that individual courage, properly applied at the right moment, can shift the entire trajectory of historical development. One 17-year-old girl's decision to choose dignity over survival contributed to the eventual collapse of colonial rule across an entire continent, proving that even the most powerless people possess the ability to change the world when they find the courage to act. The fire that began as personal revenge became a symbol of universal human dignity, a reminder that systems of oppression carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and that justice, though it may be delayed, will eventually find expression through those brave enough to light the flame and feed it with everything they possess. Amara stood in the doorway of Monsieur Laurent's study, watching the colonial ledgers burn while flames licked at her bare ankles. She had not fled the fire she had unleashed. She had become part of it, choosing to witness every moment of the justice she had delivered. Sometimes the price of freedom is not escape, but the courage to see your choices through to their end. The smoke stung her eyes and burned her throat, but she remained motionless as painted portraits of dead Belgians curled and blackened in their golden frames. The heat pressed against her skin like a living thing, demanding she retreat. But retreat meant returning to a life of forced labor that had already killed her spirit. Here in this burning mansion she felt more alive than she had in 17 years of colonial oppression. She could hear the Dubois family's desperate voices echoing through the smoke-filled hallway. Monsieur Laurent's commanding tone now cracked with fear. Madame Claire's refined speech broke with terror. The children's cries pierced the roar of flames like prayers to an unmerciful God. A part of Amara urged her to help them escape, but she remembered Laurent's casual words about culling the weak through starvation. The moral weight of her choice pressed down like humid air before a storm, but Amara did not waver. She had crossed the line from victim to agent of change. In this burning house she was no longer enslaved property. She was judge, jury, and executioner. A massive crash echoed as the ceiling collapsed. Through the doorway she could see the family huddled near windows where Laurent had cracked the glass. The opening was too small for escape and too high to survive the fall. Justice burned with methodical precision. Outside, the forced laborers faced their own moral crisis. Some approached the burning mansion with water buckets, but moved reluctantly, as if their bodies rebelled against saving their oppressors. Others made no pretense of rescue. Old Tata Kanzonzi spat into the dirt when asked if they should help. Save them for what? So they can reduce our rations again. These people had spent their lives preserving the system that enslaved them. Now faced with the chance to break that cycle, they discovered that liberation felt more like sin than salvation. Mama Nsala reached the house and called out desperately, "Amara, child, come away from there." From within the inferno came laughter, high and clear and utterly without fear. It was the sound of someone who had found peace in destruction. Inside the study, Amara heard her mother's voice and felt momentary hesitation. Nsala had sacrificed everything to keep her daughter alive. Was this how that love should be repaid? But then she remembered the account books that reduced humans to statistics. Her mother's love was real, but it was also a trap that bound her to accepting degradation as the price of survival. Tonight she had chosen dignity over safety. The flames climbed higher, reaching the family's bedrooms where they had slept in imported silk while workers shivered on straw mats. As she watched her former prison burn, Amara understood what freedom meant. It was the power to choose your own ending. The roof beam crashed down like divine judgment, sending sparks through the night as the mansion entered its death throes. By 3 o'clock Christmas morning, The structure that had symbolized European superiority was collapsing. What began as one girl's desperate act had become something larger, a reckoning that would challenge assumptions about power across colonial Africa. Inside, the air became unbreathable, the temperature made survival impossible, yet the family's voices continued, growing weaker as they clung to life. Laurent made one final attempt to break the window, wrapping his hands in burning fabric. The glass finally shattered, but the 30-foot drop onto rocks meant certain death. Claire clutched her unconscious youngest son while Marguerite gasped for air at the broken window. The girl who had learned European etiquette now faced a lesson no colonial education could teach. That privilege provides no protection against consequences. Nearly 90 forced laborers now watched their oppressors die in flames of their own excess. Some wept from complex emotions, others maintained silence, understanding that this fire would destroy more than physical structures. It would end the entire system that had given meaning to colonial hierarchy. Dr. van der Berg suggested organizing rescue efforts, but everyone knew intervention was impossible. The fire had consumed too much, burned too hot. This was no longer an emergency requiring response but a funeral requiring witness. By 3:30, no human sounds emerged except crackling timber and falling beams that marked the family's transition from colonial masters to historical memory. The mansion's destruction was spectacular and complete. The grand staircase crumbled into basement ruins. The dining room became a pit of glowing coals. As dawn approached, what remained resembled a massive funeral pyre built from symbols of colonial exploitation. The chimney stood alone like a tombstone marking the grave of European superiority. Among the ashes, investigators would find melted silver and bone fragments, but no records of systematic brutality. Those had burned first. The most haunting question remained unanswered. In the study's ashes, searchers found no trace of an 18th body. Had Amara escaped into the forest, or had the fire transformed her into something beyond physical existence? A legend that would outlive everyone who witnessed her choice to burn rather than bow. Historical records would document witness testimony of a figure moving calmly through flames, seemingly unaffected by deadly smoke and heat. Some claimed to see a young woman dancing in fire like cooling rain. Whether accurate or products of traumatized minds, these accounts captured something essential about transformation from victim to agent of change. Within months, similar fires began occurring across Belgian Congo with alarming frequency. Plantation houses burned in Katanga, administrative buildings caught fire in Kasai, always leaving behind brass keys with Luba engravings. The economic impact extended beyond property damage as European investors grew nervous about colonial stability. Amara's Christmas fire had demonstrated that European power was not absolute, that the system contained seeds of its own destruction. One girl's act became a template for others, reaching their breaking points with colonial brutality. The legend spread beyond Congo's borders, inspiring resistance across colonial Africa. The most significant impact was psychological. Colonial officials who once slept peacefully now lay awake listening for footsteps, watching for smoke. Their absolute power was revealed as illusion dependent on African cooperation. The fire had shattered the myth of European invincibility that undergirded the entire colonial project across Africa. Within weeks of the Christmas blaze, reports reached Leopoldville of work slowdowns and mysterious accidents at plantations throughout Kasai Province. Workers who had never shown defiance began arriving late, tools broke with suspicious frequency, and European overseers found their authority questioned in ways that had never happened before. The colonial administration struggled to understand how news of one girl's act had spread so quickly through communities they believed they controlled completely. Father Mathieu Blanchard, the Belgian priest who ran the Catholic mission near the former Dubois plantation, wrote extensively in his private journals about the profound changes he witnessed among his African parishioners following the fire. Where once they had accepted colonial teachings about European superiority and divine approval of racial hierarchy, they now questioned everything with intensity that alarmed colonial authorities. The brass keys found at subsequent fire sites became objects of particular fascination and fear among both European administrators and African communities. Colonial investigators brought in specialists from Brussels to analyze the metalwork, but the traditional Luba engravings defied easy interpretation. Some symbols appeared to reference ancestral guidance for those who chose justice over safety, while others seemed to invoke protection for warriors fighting against overwhelming odds. African blacksmiths across the region began reporting unusual requests for similar keys, though most denied any knowledge of their significance when questioned by colonial police. The underground network that emerged to share information about resistance techniques operated with sophistication that challenged every European assumption about African organizational capacity and intelligence. The economic consequences proved even more devastating than the immediate property damage. Lloyd's of London, the primary insurer for colonial enterprises in Congo, began refusing coverage for isolated plantation properties after investigating the pattern of systematic destruction. Without insurance protection, European investors withdrew funding for new agricultural ventures, while existing operations struggled to secure credit for expansion or modernization. The Belgian Congo Company's annual report to shareholders in 1953 acknowledged significant losses from what they termed unexplained combustion events, though they carefully avoided any suggestion that organized African resistance was responsible. Stock prices for colonial agricultural enterprises fell sharply as London financial markets absorbed the implications of systematic targeting of European property by people previously dismissed as incapable of strategic thinking. Governor-General Léon Pétaillon's confidential correspondence with Brussels, released during Congo's independence negotiations, revealed growing panic among colonial leadership about their inability to prevent or predict the fires. Traditional intelligence networks that relied on African collaborators proved useless, as the resistance movement operated according to principles that transcended colonial attempts to divide and control local populations. The legend of Amara Mukendi evolved beyond historical fact into something approaching religious inspiration for colonized people across Africa. Stories of the Fire Girl reached Nigerian independence activists, Kenyan resistance fighters, and South African anti-apartheid organizers, each group adapting her example to their specific circumstances while preserving the core message that individual courage could challenge seemingly unshakable systems of oppression. By 1960, when Congo achieved independence, the fires had stopped, leaving only stories and questions about the girl who chose fire over bondage. The new government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission would later estimate that Amara's Christmas fire had directly inspired over 200 similar incidents across colonial Africa, contributing measurably to the collapse of European rule throughout the continent. Today visitors find only empty forest and a brick chimney marking where the mansion stood. Locals say on humid December nights, you can smell wood smoke on the wind and hear bare feet moving through darkness. They say the Fire Girl became part of the land itself, waiting for justice to be needed again. The Amara Mukendi Memorial Foundation, established by the post-independence government, continues to provide scholarships for young African women pursuing education in fields that promote social justice and human rights. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.